I don't know that many pubs in the Norfolk Broads, but 2 of them you can only reach by water. It feels like tying up at a trading station. This is a strange and unique patch of countryside by English standards. It no longer has any real communities, and not much work for that matter. From Lowestoft, Great Yarmouth and Horsey on the coast, all the way inland to Norwich, there's a thinly inhabited patchwork of streams, meres, reed swamps and flood meadows. This is Broadland, East Anglia's answer to the Everglades. Yet if it's lost most of its original communities, it's by no means devoid of people. A new breed of part-time marsh folk, boaters, holidaymakers, painters, now haunt the Broads. They haven't entirely destroyed its sense of wildness and raise the intriguing question: can a large patch of countryside be entirely defined by leisure use? Broadland is a prospect of vast skies and dead, flat, empty marshes. But it wasn't always like this. Once the region was a honeycomb of industry. The Broads themselves were peat mines abandoned when the sea level rose and flooded the diggings 7 centuries ago. In time, the area became a haven for fishermen, messers about in boats and reed cutters. Now the residents are mostly people enthralled to the watery spirit of the place, like Keith MacDougall of Catfield Broad.
I spent my boyhood here, right in the middle of the Ant Valley in the Norfolk Broads, and it's rather a special place. I've known it all my life. And behind me here, you'll see my family home, where I was brought up, and I spent all my childhood. And over here, of course, you see all the water and the fens, where I spent hours paddling about in canoes, looking at the wildlife.
Half of East Anglia was like this once, an immense waste of wetland plants and animals. And as the fens were drained, Broadland became a last refuge for species like the crane and the otter. It was an amphibious paradise. Even the Broadlanders themselves sometimes strode about the marshes on stilts like wading birds. Keith MacDougall explored them later as a young naturalist, helping his father take cinefilms of Broadland life.
It was really a small nature reserve with a farm attached to it. It was a very evocative sort of place to live, because as you lay in your little bedroom at the back at night, in a summer evening, you heard the bitterns booming. And I can honestly say that I was kept awake by the booming bitterns.
Broadland was, and still is in many places, a checkerboard of different habitats, from tidal marshes to the wet woodland known as Carr. And its human inhabitants are just as tangily individual.
Broadland is not just the water of the Broads. It's a whole environmental area. The marshes, the alder cars, the reed beds. Without those, Broadland would be nothing.
You can't see the Broads unless you're on the water. People come to Norfolk expecting to see vast vistas of water and reeds from the roads. They can't do it. They can see the grazing marshes at Halvergate and places like that from the road, but if they want to see fen and Broadland, as I have experienced it, you've got to get down on the water and see it from the water, really.
The big thing for an artist is the sky. The sky, the Norfolk skies are famous. And I know that from personal experience, standing out in the middle of the Halvergate marshes sometimes, you will actually see clouds which actually appear to be falling down on you.
Braden, of course, is salt water. And it is right up to Hadley Cross. So you've got not only fresh water in the Broads, you've got salt Broads, and it gives you a variance of wildlife.
I've always felt the reed is the most beautiful plant in the world. It's a very gentle, elegant plant, and it changes according to the time of the year. To sail along a stretch of the Broads perhaps late autumn, and to see the golden colour of the reed reflected in the water is a very beautiful sight.
When you get sun on reed, it always lights up. It gives that lovely colour. And I have a great love for marshes. This is my second home. My wife says it's my first, but I do enjoy the marshes. Peaceful, different world out here.
There are few other places where Eric Edwards could carry on his craft. He's been harvesting reeds for more than 30 years, but he may be the last full-time cutter left in the Broads.
Years ago I was coming on an old bike. I've got a van now, but just get in my little boat, come across the river, and from reed cutting, I mean you cut reed through the winter. Then you start in sort of December, middle of December, and you stop cutting reed about middle of April. Well, I'd go to the reed bed and start cutting with a scythe. You can't cut reed until the leaf comes off. You want a good old wind frost, that'll take the leaf off. I think when you come onto a marsh, it's a different kind of world. You've got everything around you, you've got the wildlife around you. You see the obvious things like the moorhens, and you see marsh harriers at times, and you see the kingfisher occasionally. And when you're actually reed cutting, I always say the most prettiest bird on the marsh is the bearded tits. They're gorgeous, and they generally know when you're there. As soon as you start working, they start to forage along the edge of the reed, and they are gorgeous birds.
I was about 5 or 6 when I moved to Norfolk, but I still have very vivid memories of my first days, my first weeks, my first years in Norfolk. It was a place full of mystery. It was undiscovered. It was exciting. There was all sorts of things for a young boy to get involved in. The place was full of wildlife and birds and butterflies, and I couldn't wait to get out there. I always felt I was rather like Tom Sawyer, exploring the wetlands of the Mississippi. There were places here which I honestly felt nobody had ever been to before.
And one celebrated Broadland animal was an explorer in a new land itself, the coypu from South America.
The coypu bear the valuable fur known commercially as nutria. In the years before the war, nutria was as highly esteemed by women as mink is today. To meet the demands, coypu were imported to England in 1929 and bred here on fur farms.
The aim was to produce homegrown nutria, and when a few of the animals escaped, nobody was very worried. These foreigners would never survive a Norfolk winter in the wild. But they took to the Broads like, well, water rats to water.
Farmers had lived with coypu from 1935 onwards, and they had seen how they had multiplied. And farmers, I mean, had their own little war against the coypu by shooting and whatnot, and they were of the opinion that you could never eradicate coypu. The amazing thing was, when coypu first came about, farmers, oh, they were happy about it because they were keeping the dikes clean, clearing all the vegetation. It was saving them a job. Until they start attacking their crops, well, that was a different story.
We used to get huge coypus here, almost as big as my Labrador almost, it seemed like it. And they were very gentle creatures. They had these big yellow fangs, they looked fierce, but they weren't fierce at all, and they're vegetarians.
The largest one I ever shot was a 19 3/4 pound coypu. It set me thinking, because I'd heard these old marshmen talking about this great old 35-pounders, boy. You know, and I thought, well, I'll issue a reward for any coypu over 22 pounds. Alec Bablock, the landlord of the pub called the Stracy Arms. Alex rang up and said, one of the old marshmen had got a coypu there, which weighed 22 pounds. And I said, hold him there and I'll come over and give me £6. And I went along to Stracy, and in the back room of the pub there was this coipu on the scales with 22 pound on it, exact. And I was about to give the old blighter his £6, and I picked the coipu up by its tail, and I said, there we are, Yaiton, you've got a very good coipu here. And as I shook it, a big stone dropped out of its mouth. They'll take your leg up as soon as look at you, these marshmen round here. They're great ones for practical jokes. Still, I bought him a beer instead.
The teeming wetlands of the Broads have been fertile breeding grounds for imaginative naturalists too. Percy Trett was first guided round the marshes by his grandfather, who in turn was a friend of Arthur Patterson from Great Yarmouth. Patterson wrote some of the first great accounts of Norfolk wildlife under the name of John Knowlittle, but he knew a lot and taught much of it to Ted Ellis. Ted was the people's naturalist and the acknowledged authority on the natural history of the Broads. After the war, he bought and lived at Wheatfen Broad in the extreme west of Broadland. Sadly, he died in 1986, but his widow Phyllis, now in her mid-80s, lives on there.
Oh, I just thought it was the one place in the world where I wanted to live. And we went out on the water in the old litter boat, now defunct, and saw all this beautiful, clean water and no disturbance, no motorboats, and plants and birds singing. As soon as I saw it in 1936, I thought this is where I'd like to live. I had, of course, visited Wheatfen with Ted, but it wasn't until we lived here that I realised quite what a paradise it was, with winding waterways and pools and birds and plants. And as the summer progressed, so the place grew ever more wonderful to me. The meadow-like marshes, or as they call them here, the litter marshes, had so many different flowers, orchids, meadow rue, meadow sweet. All sorts of flowers were blooming in amongst the hay.
And it was some hay, scented with water mint and bog myrtle and the nectar of myriads of flowers. It was the cutting of hay and of other semi-wild crops like reed, sedge and willow for thatching and basket making that kept open Broadland's patchwork of water and fen.
You have to rake it all out, you have to dress it with a rake and a little comb. Everything's done by hand. Normally you have to be dressed out and trounced down onto a board, a trouncing board, tied up and put onto the boat. But it has to be all cleaned out, all the old grass and rubbish have to come out of the bunch and tied into bundles. There'd probably be more people working the marshes years ago. You'd have seen more marshmen here. When I come here, there's 3 of us. I still have a affection for the old boys of years ago with the old side. I mean, I was taught for a good craftsman. They taught you the right kind of way, and it lived with you for the rest of your life, I think. Pride of work, and I think in life that means a lot. Generally, if you got some reed in the marsh, you carry it over hand to the boat, and then punt it out to the stave, or you have a reed lighter and take it by reed lighter.
There were wherries still trading on the Broads when I came here, admittedly only a few, but they still conjure up vivid memories. These great big black sails lumbering across the marshes. And I must have stored this memory in my mind, because quite often I paint these things now.
Wherries, the Broads' all-purpose workhorses, almost grew out of the landscape. Their tall sails could catch the wind over the highest reed beds and waft the boats down the narrow channels as elegantly as swans.
On the front of the wherry was always a white patch, because they used to travel sometimes in the dusk and the gloaming, and this white patch would warn other boats that they were coming. You could see it. It was quite startling. Each wherry and each skipper had his own a little wind vane, which is known as a Jenny Morgan. You'd be able to tell which wherry was coming down, not only by the skipper's Jenny Morgan, but the colour banding on the top of the mast, which denoted the owners. Grandfather had 2 wherries which he used to ply from Stokesby to Yarmouth. They'd take corn and flour down to the town and bring back coal and merchandise back to the villages, because the wherries were like the lorries for this area.
Wherries used to ply the Broads for work, but in the 1930s they began to be used for leisure sailing, as Phyllis Ellis recalls.
I was married in '38, and the last holiday I had with my parents sailing, by which time they got a proper cabin boat, was in 1938.
Quick, there's no time.
In the early days, it was lovely. It was peaceful and quiet. It was the clearness of the water, the clarity. When one was sailing, you washed up over the side of the dike because it was clean. Especially if you went up to Erstead, you could almost drink the water up there. We didn't, but you could have done. I would have done.
60 years on, Phyllis still enjoys sailing and still has her memories.
Cattle on the marshes again. They used to come over from Ireland, you know, and be sold in the market.
The windmills of Norfolk, I suppose, in one simple picture, evoke memories of the Broads. People look at the windmill and they immediately think of the Norfolk Broads. My first memories of the mills were of rather derelict mills because the sails had fallen to pieces and they were rather like skeletons, I suppose, silhouetted against the Norfolk sky. In some cases the mills have been restored, but somehow they looked even better when they were in a semi-derelict state.
When I first come down here, there were 6 windmills, and they all pumped into the Halbergate Fleet, which we now come alongside and you saw. Well, they used to lift the water up and push it into the fleet, and the fleet used to go to right away to Braden, which is 5 miles away, and the sluice doors used to open with the tides and let the water out, so the marshes didn't get flooded. You see? They called them wind pumps, we used to call them windmills, but there's no difference.
I can remember Halbergate when it was still being drained in the traditional way, but by the windmills. If you stood by Burney High Mill, then there'd be a great cascade of foamy water coming out of it. If there were periods of heavy rain in the winter and there was no wind so that the windmills were unable to work, then within a few days the dike level would increase, and before you knew where you were, there'd be this most marvellous shallow lagoons and pools on the marshes, which attracted literally hundreds and hundreds of pink-footed and white-fronted geese.
Each winter we used to have coming down here from Norway and the Arctic Circle, geese that had bred there, and they spend the winter with us. And we had 4,000 to 5,000 wintering white front and pink-foot geese on these marshes here. During the day, they would fly in from Scrooby Island, which lies 2.5 miles out at sea. They'd fly in over the town, skein after skein of them, all clamouring and shouting. The town used to stop. People would stop and look up and watch the geese fly in at dawn and out at dusk.
I think the excitement of watching a great mass of geese is their calls, and to see them flying in formation against a marvellous sky. It was a magical scene.
And then, gradually, the magic began to seep away. Diesel pumps were introduced, and for the first time it became possible to drain the marshes even when there was no wind. The silver meadows, shimmering with wildfowl in winter, began to be replaced by reseeded pastures and docile cattle. And as the reed beds began to dry out too, so the bitterns began to disappear.
We used to have bitterns breeding here regularly, but most regrettably they're not breeding on the Catfield marshes anymore. And in fact, I think in the Broad there are only 2 or 3 pairs now at all. But when I was a boy, we found a nest and we decided to try and photograph it. Bit by bit, we erected a hide so that we could get close to the nest and photograph the bird on its nest. A bittern likes to nest in about 4 or 5 inches of water on a tussock. So you have to wade very quietly through the reeds to get to the hide, to slip into it, and slowly the mother bird comes creeping onto the nests and sort of settles down onto the nests, and there you are, and you start taking your photograph.
They were bitterns, and they lived in the reeds, and they used to make a booming noise, which reminded my grandfather's being a fisherman of the Norfolk lightship, and exactly like it. We can't do it though, really. Do you want me to try? And terrible, especially in a fog. It's exactly like a lightship. And they'd stand in the reed, and if you could get near them, you'd see them stand right still, and they look exactly like reeds, cells.
We watched a male bittern bowman, and what he did, his body was upright like that, he leant his head down and his neck up like that, and it boom, and it was a marvellous sound.
The bittern, the night raven, was at the heart of Broadland folklore. One local story was that it boomed by pushing its bill into a reed and blowing it like a trumpet. The first survey of Broadland bitterns in 1955 was organised by the Norfolk ornithologist Michael Seago. By gathering together information and sightings from keepers and marshmen, he established that the population included some 55 booming males. Both the males and the silent females are very secretive, and the males notoriously polygamous. But by 1970, numbers of boomers had halved, and by 1994 were down to just 2. The drastic decline of the bittern, one of the region's most ancient citizens, was another sign that the whole Broadland ecosystem was beginning to deteriorate. Before the war, the Broads was an idyllic waterscape, the South Seas of eastern England, and a place where real children echoed the adventures of Arthur Ransom's Swallows and Amazon gangs.
I learned to sail on Barton Broad in the early 1950s. Up to the middle of the 1950s, Barton Broad Regatta was the big event of the August bank holiday. I remember one year we rented Hator, the wherry, and we had a sort of waterborne party. My father, I think, was the president of Barton Broad Regatta in those days. We had a big picnic and we had a very jolly time indeed amongst the water lilies and the aquatic plants. That's a memory I like to keep. Pollution was a spectre over the horizon.
Across the marsh is the ford. We could walk there from the house without very much trouble and take the family swimming. When they went to school, they invited their friends, and we used to have parties of 20 odd there swimming and enjoying ourselves.
Those carefree Broadland summers seem inextricable from the unsullied nature of the water then. To be able to nose through water lilies, glimpsing scenes as hectic with life as rock pools, is becoming a distant memory.
As a child, I would row across this broad. It was covered with water lilies and plants, and it was great fun, but quite difficult because everywhere you went, the oars were tangled to the weeds.
And then the Broadland waters began to cloud. Reed beds died back, whole species vanished. At first it was thought that phosphates from detergents were the main cause of the trouble, fertilizing the algae so much that it blanketed out other aquatic plants. But it soon became clear that nitrate fertilizer washed out of Norfolk's arable prairies was the main culprit, and the process of water deterioration was nightmarishly complex. Sewage, overflowing farm slurry pits, silt stirred up by motor cruisers all played a part. It was a vicious circle. The faster the algae grew, the more oxygen it took up, and the more turbid the water became. Pike and pondweeds alike were in effect suffocated, and the death of the fish had impacts higher up the food chain.
Ospreys are one of the features, particularly in May and again in late August and early September. They would stay for days, even weeks, and then they would catch fish in the Broad. He would spot a fish and then he would dive into the water, completely disappear, and we had this marvellous shower of spray, and he'd then catch the fish one foot in front of the other and struggle with it. It would be a great shudder to clear his plumage of water, and then off he would go into the nearest woods. In those days, ospreys would be here for days, even weeks, but now, because of the cloudiness of the water, they're unable to see to fish, so they merely pass through. They might stay for half an hour, but that's all.
By the middle 1950s, things were definitely going wrong. Barton Broad Regatta still goes on, with no water lilies, or very few. And the water is not the same colour as it used to be. And you can't see the bottom.
The swimming parties went on till 1953, when we suddenly noticed a tremendous difference in the water quality and the fact that the water plants suddenly disappeared. The water became thick so that you couldn't see to the bottom, and we stopped swimming.
I think the last time I swam in Barton Broad was 1953. And I haven't swum in that broad, and I don't think anybody does voluntarily now.
Come on, girls, let's go.
After the war, it started to go wrong. I think people had increased leisure. The Broads became a little bit overpopularised. It brought about an increase of huge motorised cruises.
I had done one trip up to Norwich in a cruiser. If there were any birds, I certainly didn't hear them because of the engine. If there were any smells, you didn't smell them because you got diesel fumes.
Nowadays, there's all rush and hurry. Boats bustling around with radios blaring on. You know, you've never heard a radio, a portable radio in pre-war.
Pleasure cruising is now far and away the dominant activity in the Broads. It's what pulls in the money and what gives a much wider range of people the chance to explore Broadland by water. But the boats have brought problems in their wake, quite literally. Even at the low speeds enforced here, their wash stirs up mud from the bottom and nibbles insidiously away at the banks. But powerboaters weren't the only mammals to be damaging the banks. Those koipu were also on the move.
Well, in '63, you see, Ted rather liked them, and the poor things, it was terribly frosty, and they started eating each other's tails. And we had an old goat shed down on the marsh, so Ted used to feed them on bread. He even brought some indoors and warmed them up. I fear we regretted it afterwards, because the koipus increased in such numbers that in 1 year we caught and killed 2,000 on our marshes.
Koipu are mild-tempered, affectionate, cuddly animals, but they have huge appetites and multiply prodigiously. The Ministry of Agriculture suggested that there were 200,000 in Broadland at the beginning of the 1960s, that their population was increasing sixfold every year and would soon hit 3.5 million. But this was ministry propaganda, and the illustration on their koipu pamphlet was like a monster from a medieval bestiary. Independent biologists' figures show that the maximum figure was more like 70,000.
The marshes smelt of koipu, and in the evenings you'd hear them. They had such doleful cries. "Oh, oh," mournful. Rather like a cow coughing. Worse than that.
By the 1970s, trappers were reporting that koipu were increasing, and it was becoming difficult for them to control. I trapped westward marshes, and I was there for a total of 17 weeks, and I trapped in that period 527 koipus. Then had to move on, and of course coming back in 6 months' time it was just as bad again.
This is a use for koipu that few people know about.
It's superior to hare. It's possibly on a par, maybe even slightly above veal. And of course it's far better than rabbit.
Well, of course we ate koipu. Don't send good food down the drain. Didn't taste very different from rabbit or hare. It's very good food. Bit of a nuisance to prepare. You fry it, or stew it, or do whatever you do, or bake it. I didn't bake it. I prefer to fry it with onions and apples and herbs, and then casserole it.
Koipu trappers remain convinced that it was the huge bonuses they were paid that made the campaign to eradicate the koipu so successful. And it is the only naturalized exotic mammal ever to have been completely wiped out in this country.
I felt a bit sorry for the koipu, actually, the way it had to be eradicated like that, because they were gentle creatures, but they were a bit of a pest.
I share Keith McDougall's sense of sadness about the koipu's demise, and cherish a faint hope that a small, well-behaved colony continue to sport in a remote creek. In some senses, their rise and fall is a parable for the changing fortunes of Broadland. A wild place, invaded by strangers, and then the whole lot tamed and sanitized.
I do miss the quietness and the seeing of the rarities up there. They've gone, and that's a sad part to me, and I feel sorry about that. And of course you miss the old people, you know, the characters. the marshmen and such like, they seem to have gone. The marsh houses used to support families. They are no longer occupied.
People see it as a romantic job, but it's hard graft really to be a reed cutter, especially in the winter time when you get wind frost and snow and ice. I've got a couple of grandchildren that I shall show them the job, but whether they'll ever do it, I don't know.
I think anybody who had my good fortune to have a childhood on this wonderful little farm, surrounded by livestock and all the activities, the routine of a small family farm, and being able to escape into this wilderness, this wildlife wilderness, must feel nostalgic.
Those were the best days because you could spend all day here and see hardly anybody else. Those days are gone forever.
I'm pushing 69 now, and yesterday seems more alive than today. And yes, you've got to be nostalgic. It was better then.
But I'm more optimistic myself. Broadland now has the same kind of status and protection as a national park, and tourist money is helping to clear up the worst excesses of pollution. Many Broadland crafts are reviving, and reed is coming back into fashion for thatching. I think we still have a nostalgic belief in our countryside's history, and maybe in the work ethic too, that makes us uncomfortable about rural places managed purely for pleasure. Yet why shouldn't wild places exist for our recreation and inspiration? We could even, if we wanted them, dig another set of Broads, just like the peat miners did 7 centuries ago.
I love the Broads. There's nowhere else like it. I mean, you can travel all over the world, but you'll never find anything like the Norfolk Broads.
Next week's postcard comes from the home of the Golden Eagle, the Scottish Highlands. That's next Wednesday at 9:50 here on BBC Two.